I'm entering the village of North Marston from Carter's Lane. Just down here at the bend, it becomes the Quainton Road. In the past, it's had a number of names: Hawkshaw Road, Hawkshaw Street, Quainton Street and Lower End. From the early part of the 19th century, this had quickly become the most densely populated part of the village, and people that lived here were called downtowners, in a not very positive way. But I'm leaping ahead a bit. The reason I've stopped here, next to Potter's Farm, is because just below here on the left used to be a few old cottages, and one of them, in 1806, was the scene of a brutal double murder in which a woman and her adult son met their ends in a particularly gruesome way. The murderer was never caught, but he or she is unlikely to be alive. Anyway, I digress. If we go down to the corner, we can look up the road. What we see now would not have been recognisable to either the murderer or his victims, because up until the late 1700s, this was a major part of the village green, common land that extended up to the High Street and along and up Church Street. It was grazing land that anyone could use, and nobody lived on it, although many lived around it. Let's have a look at the map of the green. And this is a fascinating picture showing the extent of the village green before 1778. As you can see, it runs almost from the church right away along the High Street, down the Granber Road to Stephen's Farm. But the main point of interest for this film is it extends all the way along the Quainton Road, and in fact is very much wider than the existing road. I've marked 3 points of reference on this map in red: Potter's Farm, the Sportsman's Arms and the Wheat Sheaf, because we'll be dealing with those a bit more later on. I've also marked modern reference points like the site of the village hall and Portway High Street, Quainton Road and Carter's Lane. So this gives you a feel for the extent of that village green. It was absolutely massive. The width of the green in places is quite extensive. In fact, the distance between Potter's Farm and the Sportsman's Arms, as you can see from this map, is the best part of a quarter of a mile. It's quite a width across there. So properties on the edge were way back from the existing road, the existing Quainton Road, which you can see faintly marked underneath the green. That's there for a reference because there wasn't a road there when the green was there. There was probably a track following the course of the road as we know it, but certainly no road per se. And now let's go and see some of the earlier properties that lie set back from the road where they used to edge the village green. The Sportsman's Arms was a popular pub with farmers and folk coming into the village from Carter's Lane. Being the last pub on the edge of the village, it probably wasn't troubled too much by the village constable. The earliest records for the Sportsman's Arms date back to 1753, so it was certainly here before the Enclosure Act of 1778, as its position set right back from the road tells us. Its nearest neighbour on the opposite side of the green would have been Potter's Farm, a quarter of a mile away. The Sportsman became a private house in 1956. Let's have another look at that map of the green, which shows the distance between the Sportsman's Arms and Potter's Farm. The Enclosure Act wasn't about buildings, it was about land. This meant if your house happened to be on land that was awarded to someone else, you either had to get off or become their tenant. The land often used for housing poorer people was common land, since it had no ascribed ownership, and for many years after enclosure in 1778 there was a boom in the construction of property on common land. The village green gradually diminishing to the few patches of green that exist to this day, for example outside the Pilgrim. This is 51 Quainton Road, an unoccupied cottage built end on to the village green sometime in the early 1700s. It was originally a two-bay timber-framed cottage with a hipped thatched roof. At some time during the early to mid-19th century, it was extended to create a dwelling for 3 families instead of 2. It hasn't been lived in for a number of years and is a listed building virtually invisible from the road, hidden behind a more recent development. The Enclosure Act of 1778 had reduced the size of the village green, so it no longer included the area around what is now Quainton Road, and soon there were dozens of small cottages dotted along its length, mainly tenanted, as the land they were built on had been awarded to a handful of local owners. It was in the landowner's interest to have tenanted cottages on the land, providing a steady source of income. The land behind these tenanted properties remained agricultural. Let's look at a map of Quainton Road in the 1870s, 100 years after enclosure. And here's Quainton Road from a survey done by the Ordnance Survey in the 1870s, so literally 100 years after enclosure. And look at the development that's taken place along the Quainton Road in that time. I've marked our 3 points of reference. The red star is Potter's Farm, the blue star is the Sportsman's Arms, and the green star, the Wheatsheaf Inn, each end of Quainton Road. But all the way along, as you can see, all those little black dots are properties. So lots and lots of people are living down Quainton Road now, right on the road as we know it today. So all these new tenanted properties that have sprung up along the Quainton Road, what did they look like? We have a photograph of 2 of them. This tiny cottage is basically one room with a mezzanine floor at one end, accessed by a ladder where you'd sleep. Your space will be shared with your livestock, if you had any, during the winter. And this larger cottage is a good example of a timber-framed cottage that was probably built or beginning of the 1800s. When the railway came to Granborough Road, bricks became more accessible, and those that could afford it would have clad their timber-framed cottage with brick like this. This particular cottage housed 1 family, but many of this size and build housed 2. Note the roof is still thatched. But now let's carry on with our journey in the real world Quainton Road. The word close, when applied to a road, we nowadays assume means dead-end road or not a through road for traffic. But for hundreds of years, a close, from the Middle English closen, meant an enclosed piece of land. Prior to the road we now know as Shepherd's Close, there was indeed a close belonging to someone called Shepherd, and this forms a land upon which Shepherd's Close was built. All the closes in Quainton Road, Dudley Close, Carter's Meadow and Shepherd's Close, are named after previous landowners. The parish barn, which is also referred to as the threshing barn or the labourer's barn, was built in 1888 from local subscriptions. It was built so that farm labourers had somewhere to thresh their small crops of cereal that they grew to feed their chickens. The barn was built by a local builder called John Price for the princely sum of £26. Although it was 2 years after the barn's construction, John Price was paid in full. As we have seen, in the main the residents of Quainton Road from the earliest times were not wealthy freeholders but relatively poor tenants. As such, their cottages would not have had wells, so tenants had to walk to the town well, what we now call Sean's Well, for their water. A tidy step if you lived down the very bottom of Quainton Road, especially carrying a couple of heavy pails of water. In the winter, with roads no more than muddy tracks, it must have been a nightmare. When the parish council was formed in 1894, They had long debates about this issue and finally agreed to commission the piping of well water to the top of Quainton Road, where a cistern was dug and a hand-operated water pump installed. In the following picture, we can see the pump in use. And here's a woman stood by the water pump at the top of Quainton Road. Behind her you can see the pub sign for the Wheatsheaf Inn, and beyond that the High Street. This would have been quite a long walk for some of the people along the Quainton Road, but not as far as the walk to the town well. The primitive Methodist church was one of two Methodist churches in the village, the other being the Wesleyan church in Shorn Lane. By and large, the Prims, as they were known, were essentially working class dissenters, their lay preachers being tradesmen or agricultural workers. They considered the Wesleyans too middle class and too close to Anglicans for comfort. Situated in the Quainton Road, the hub of working class North Marston, and built in 1839, the Prim Chapel was popular and well attended. And finally the Wheatsheaf Inn at the very top of Quainton Road, where it meets the High Street. For many years a popular pub with Quainton Road residents, it finally ceased trading in the early 1950s, and like the Sportsman's Arms, became a private house soon afterwards. Set well back from the road, this is another of the original pre-1778 properties.